bit about what policies to put in place, what's necessary in the environment to encourage innovation in the place in which the innovators start working in the first place. Screen is yours. As Colin already mentioned, we take about 1 hour. We take small questions, clarification questions during the seminar, and we leave more substantive discussions towards the end.
Okay, great. Yeah. Thank you so much.
To ask questions, I should just stress, to ask questions, just raise your hand and we'll unmute you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mina, for this great introduction, and thank you so much for having me. So let me share my screen. Oh, I cannot share yet.
Let's see, I'm trying to figure out why this is not working.
Try again.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Okay, can you see my slides? Great. So let me get started, and I'm really excited to have the chance to present my work titled The Global Race for Talent, Brain Drain, Knowledge Transfer, and Growth. And I want to start with an example to describe the concepts that I will discuss today. And here you see Jean Calvignac, who is a prolific French inventor who appears in my data from the European Patent Office. In fact, here is an example of a real patent that he filed in 1991. And from this, we learned that first, at this time, he lived in the city of Lagode in France. And second, from this patent, we also see that most of his collaborators, that is, the people that contributed to the technology in this patent, they were also based in France. Then in 1998, Calvignac moved to the United States. And we know this because of his later patents. For example, this one from 2004, which indicates that at this time, Calvignac lived in North Carolina. And most of the collaborators on his patents at this time were also based in the US. But finally, and more interestingly, even after moving to the US, Calvignac continued to work with some inventors based in France. And this is not an isolated example. In fact, there is a systematic flow of inventors from Europe to the US. And to get a sense of this, for example, between 2001 and 2010, from patent data, we see that about 6% of European national inventors live in the US in a given year on average, but only 0.4% of American inventors live in Europe in a given year on average. This flow of inventors that is often referred to as a brain drain has been a cause of concern for both Europe and the US. They have both tried to implement policies to manage these migration flows. So in this project, I first asked, how does inventors migration affect migrant productivity, collaboration networks, and the knowledge spillovers on local inventors? And second, I studied the positive implications of some real-world policies implemented to manage these migration flows. So my second question is, what is the role of tax and migration policy in shaping migration flows, the innovative capacity of the economy, productivity, and output? My paper answers these questions in 3 steps. In the first step, I bring a theoretical framework to a literature that had so far been mostly empirical. So the setup is a 2-country general equilibrium innovation-based growth model that has the following new elements. The first new element is that inventors are allowed to make migration decisions and return to their home country. And the second is that these inventors accumulate human capital by learning within interaction networks that are endogenous and that produce knowledge spillovers both within and across countries. So the key takeaway from this model will be that migration has ambiguous effects on output in the short and in the long run. And the reason is that migration produces several forces that have opposite signs and different time horizons. And I will describe these forces to you in detail. But then in order to discipline and quantify the magnitude of these different forces, I need some data that allows me to observe individuals' mobility, some proxy of their output, as well as their collaboration networks. However, one of the challenges in the empirical study of migration is the scarce availability of data that consistently track individuals across countries. So this brings me to the second part of the paper, where to overcome this problem, I built a micro-level dataset of migrant inventors between Europe and the US. And with this dataset, I then document three main results. The first is that after migration, both American and European migrants increased their patent applications by 42% per year on average. And this will be a comparison to other inventors that have characteristics similar to the migrants, but that don't move. Next, after documenting the evolution of patenting activity for migrants, I turn to the effects on their collaboration networks, which is what I will refer to as the knowledge spillovers. Here, the second result is to show that after migration, migrants reduce the share of their collaborators based in the country of origin by 20 percentage points per year on average. This is to say that the network of collaborator changes after an inventor moves. But importantly, they continue to collaborate with inventors at origin after they move, even if less frequently. And they work more frequently with inventors at destination and other migrants. And finally, the last point is to ask then what happens to those inventors in the country of origin after somebody that they work with moves away. And here I find that the local inventors at origin also increase patenting by 15% per year on average after a collaborator moves away. And again, this will be a comparison to other local inventors that work with somebody similar to the migrant who does not move away. Finally, the third step is to bring together the theory and the data. And I will do this by calibrating the parameters of my model to match the empirical results, and then study counterfactual policy exercises that resemble real-world policies implemented to manage migration flows. So in the paper, I study both tax policy in the US and changes to the H-1B visa policy in the US. And for today, my plan is to show the results from the first of these exercises. That is a 10 percentage point tax cut in the European Union for foreigners and return migrants to eliminate the brain drain. And I showed that this type of policy increases innovation in Europe and reduces innovation in the US with magnitudes that are consistent with the empirical estimates of this type of policy. However, the strength of this framework is to then also study the effect on output, both in the short and in the long run. And here I find that the introduction of this policy increases output in Europe by 1.5% per year in the short run. But eventually, in the long run, output in Europe decreases relative to the initial balanced growth path. And the reason for that is, as I mentioned before, because this policy triggers different forces that have different signs and also different time horizons. The one that I want to highlight that is at the core of this paper is given by knowledge spillovers. That is, by reducing migration flows, this policy also reduces the knowledge spillovers across countries. And eventually, this has a sizable impact on output, but it takes a long time to become effective because the knowledge spillovers affect the distribution of human capital in the economy that is a slow-moving object. So I see that there is a question here in the chat that I can take before I continue. Oh, okay. The question is to feel free to ask questions. Yeah, so please feel free to interrupt me at any point. Okay. So before going into details, here is a brief description of my contribution to the literature. And I see this paper as making a contribution to mainly three parts of the literature. The first is the one on the endogenous growth theory, where the novelty of my setup is to introduce endogenous migration decisions in an innovation-based growth model. Second, this paper also relates to the literature on talent allocation and growth. And in particular, the contribution of this paper is to focus on the effect of international migration on the allocation of talent across countries. And finally, there is a large literature that studies the relationship between immigration and innovation. And one novelty of this paper on the empirical side is to bring together observations on three important dimensions that I already briefly mentioned before. That is, my data will allow me to jointly observe individual level mobility, a proxy for individuals' output that is given by pattern applications, as well as the measure of interaction networks. Yes, Colin?
I seem to recall there was I think an NBER paper maybe a decade or so ago that was looking at the effect of the loss of Jewish co-authors in Germany at the time of the rise of the Nazis. Is that part of your, is that a paper you've come across? Was that relevant to this literature?
Yes, I think this paper should be here. I think it's a paper by Moser and co-authors.
Okay, oh, that's the Waldinger. Okay. Oh, and Buena,
Yes.
is that Alessandra Buena? Okay, okay. Thank you.
There are a couple of papers that use this sort of like use World War II as sort of a natural experiment for the reallocation of Jewish inventors.
Yes,
And
okay.
yes, and these are mostly empirical papers. So as I mentioned, one of the contributions of this particular work is to bring a theoretical framework to think about these facts in general equilibrium.
Thank you.
Okay, so now let me go into some more details, starting from the theoretical part of the paper. Here is an overview of my setup, where on the human capital side, the population is split between inventors that produce technologies and workers that produce the final good. Importantly, here in this setup, this split between inventors and workers is exogenous. And in some of my other papers, I've also explored this margin of occupational choice. And potentially, I think this could be also interesting to explore in the interaction with migration in future work. But for today, these individuals are exogenously split at birth. And then on the production side, technologies are used to improve the quality of intermediate goods that are then sold to the final good aggregator. So this means that in this economy, the production of technologies or innovation drives the increase in productivity of the final good. And this is the common setup of innovation-based growth models. Then in this paper, I study a two-country version of this economy where each of the two countries has the same structure that I just described. The novelty of my framework is to allow inventors to migrate across countries and to return to the country of origin. The second novelty is that as inventors accumulate human capital by meeting others in the economy and learning from them, they produce knowledge spillovers both within and across countries. Finally, in this setup, technology is also allowed to diffuse across countries, and the two economies trade final good and share a common exogenous interest rate.
Marta, what motivates the migration in the first place?
That's a great point. And it's actually what I was going to mention here. That is, well, first of all, in this model, we are eventually interested in the evolution of aggregate TFP. That's what I call A bar C. And then we will be studying the migration decisions of inventors. So inventors every period make a decision of where they want to live. And besides that, they produce innovations and they learn from others. So what I will show you in the next slide is exactly how both different returns to innovation and different learning patterns are the two motives that, the two reasons why inventors have incentives to move. So I'll start from the innovation side. Here, inventors are born in a given country C with initial heterogeneity across two dimensions. The first is what I call their initial talent Z, and the second is the initial foreign productivity differential epsilon, which together determine how productive an inventor is in the current period. So to be precise, in every period, an inventor produces a bundle of technologies or ideas that's denoted by Q. And this bundle is equal to the inventor's talent Z if the inventor lives in the home country. But instead, it's equal to talent Z plus the foreign productivity differential epsilon if the inventor moves abroad. So this epsilon is meant to capture idiosyncratic reasons why a particular inventor may be more productive in one country versus the other. For example, you can think about this as the particular field knowledge of an inventor that could be a good match for a certain firm in the foreign country. From here, you can already see this will be the first reason why inventors may want to move. That is, they want to move whenever they have a high draw of their foreign productivity differential epsilon. The last part of the slide here describes the returns to innovation. These are denoted by pi. And what I want to highlight here is that returns are country-specific because they are proportional to the aggregate TFP in each location. Why this is the case, it will be clear later when I show you the production side of the economy. But for now, I just want to point out that this is a second reason why inventors may want to move. That is, they want to go to the country with the highest TFP where they can earn more from their innovations. Then the next part is that both the idiosyncratic Z and epsilon evolve over time. First of all, the idiosyncratic epsilon evolves following an exogenous mean reverting AR1 process. So what this means in practice is that inventors choose to move whenever they have a high draw of their epsilon for their foreign country. But then over time, on average, this epsilon tends to revert to the mean. And if the epsilon falls to a low enough value, the inventor will eventually choose to return to the country of origin. Yes, Colin?
So every inventor gets this mean reverting process.
Yes.
So you're giving yourself a lot of degrees of freedom here. Is that what's the effect that you're trying to get with all of this flexibility in your model? And can you get it with less flexibility?
That's a great point. There are two reasons why this epsilon is important. First of all, it produces return migration. Because without the epsilon, one country in equilibrium, as I will show later, will be dominant. So all inventors would want to move to this certain place. But this idiosyncratic epsilon creates two-way movement and return migration.
And what would happen if you were to look at and let's just say an overlapping generations, or maybe even just a life cycle model? I mean, because that often seems to capture, like when you're young, you study in your home country, and then you get the human capital, you move to the US, but then you decide you want to be near your parents and you move back to Europe.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it maps exactly to the second reason why this epsilon is there. That is, in my data, what I find is that both European and American inventors, when they move, they have an increase in their productivity on average. However, if there were no epsilon in this model, or if this was just preferences of life cycle, what you would see in the equilibrium, the US will be the technological frontier. So what you would see is that when Europeans move to the US, they have an increase in productivity. But when Americans move back to Europe, or when Europeans go back, or more importantly, when Americans move to Europe, they would have a decline in productivity because they move from the technological frontier to the laggard location. This epsilon instead makes it to be the case that when Americans choose to move to Europe, they do so because they have a certain opportunity captured by the epsilon that makes them more productive after they move.
Is your data granular enough to look at what happens if people move within the US or move within Europe? Because another hypothesis has nothing to do with the US versus Europe. It just has to do with, I make a decision when I find a team that fits me better. And you're just picking up people whose better team is an intercontinental better team. Is that?
Yeah, I completely agree. In fact, when I ran my results on mobility within the European Union, I find the same qualitative results. So I want to interpret this model in general could be interpreted as a model of mobility even within a certain country, different regions within a country. And then today I will study a particular application of this to the Europe-US context, which in particular to me is interesting to allow migration policy that typically is banding across countries. Thank you.
Marta, I have just a follow-up quick question here. So the evolution of this exogenous epsilon, in a sense, is one of the main drivers of this decision. And then its feature, if it's a long cycle, you get a lot of people moving to the better epsilon country or region. when we talk about country, this makes sense, but technology tends to be available within a particular country. So I'm wondering why the results would end up, there might be something else, right? Because the technology is more or less, so maybe it's not just technology, is available within a particular country, but not so easily across countries.
Yeah, so first of all, what you said is right. And in fact, the persistence of this epsilon, I will use precisely my data on return migration to discipline how persistent the epsilon is.
Okay.
And then apart from this, I will show you in a couple of slides that this model allows for a process of technology diffusion that I think is what you meant by saying that technology is available in the country, potentially across countries. And what I will use to discipline that is the relative TFP level in two locations, because essentially the idea is that if the technology was immediately available everywhere, the two countries would always have the same productivity.
Yeah, okay.
And then the lag in productivity is going to essentially explain how fast technology diffuses across countries.
Thanks.
Thanks. Okay, so going back to the evolution of the Z and the epsilon, the next part is the evolution of talent, which depends on an endogenous process of learning from others. So that means with probability 1 minus lambda, the inventor does not have a successful meeting. And so if this happens, their talent Z prime in the next period is the same as the current Z. More interestingly, with probability lambda, the inventor does have a successful meeting with another individual denoted with the hat notation. And as a result of this meeting, the inventor has a new level of talent in the next period, Z prime, that is a combination of their own initial talent Z, as well as the productivity Q hat of the person that they meet. And this particular learning technology has a property that produces a certain result in equilibrium. That is, a relatively higher Z learns more from a relatively higher Q hat, so that in equilibrium, it is the inventors with the highest talent that have the incentive to move to the locations where there are other highly productive individuals that they can learn from. And finally, the last point here is that the probability of meeting a particular individual Q hat in this model is different for locals and for immigrants, which is one of the novelties of this setup, that is the introduction of network frictions. So where these network frictions are coming from is the following. First of all, let me define here the endogenous distribution of inventors of different types. This is what I call the mu Km. That's the mass of inventors that are born in country K and live in M in the current period. And they have a certain distribution over productivity denoted by capital F of the type Km. And the object that we're interested in is the following, what I call the endogenous interaction network. And this is a probability psi for an inventor born in C and living in D to meet somebody that is born in K and lives in M. And this probability has two components. Here, what you see first in the first line of this equation is the probability for CD to meet somebody of a different type. That has two parts. The first is just the frequency of type Km in the economy, which simply means that, for example, if there are more migrants in the economy, everybody is more likely to meet a migrant. The second component here, however, is a type-specific exogenous network friction. And what this means is that any two types may be more or less likely to meet each other. And up to now, the model is flexible on allowing these parameters to be of any kind. But I will then use my data to discipline these network friction parameters. And using my data on collaboration networks for locals and migrants, I will find that individuals are more likely to meet when they live in the same location or if they have the same nationality. And finally, the last line here simply says that these probabilities must add up to 1. And this is what defines the residual probability of meeting somebody of your same type. And here, I just want to highlight two useful features of this network structure in this setup. The first one is that these meeting probabilities are different for locals and for migrants. And so this is the third reasons why inventors have incentives to move in this setup. That is, when they move, they meet different groups of individuals with different probabilities. But second, and very importantly for this model, after an inventor moves to the foreign country, with some probability, they can still interact with inventors back in the country of origin. And through these interactions, they transfer knowledge and they make the locals at origin more productive. So this is the way in which this model captures the knowledge spillovers from migrants to locals at origin. And in fact, I will use my empirical results on the evolution of patenting of the local collaborators of migrants to discipline these parameters. Okay, so now we are ready to think about the migration problem of inventors. That is, in every period, an inventor decides where they want to go. And this problem is described by the value W for an inventor born in C and living in D. And the problem consists in comparing the value for the inventor of staying where they are. This is denoted by V, CD. Or the value of moving to the other location, that is denoted by VC minus D. But if they move, inventors have to pay a fixed cost of migration. So let me walk through the components of these values. An inventor born in C and currently living in D has a value of the following type. The first element here to the right of the equation is the current period returns to innovation. As we have seen before, these are country specific. They depend on the country where the inventor lives. They depend on the inventor idiosyncratic talent and foreign productivity differential epsilon. Then everything else after this is the continuation into the next period. That is, the inventors have a discount factor beta and the probability of survival delta. Then when the new period starts, the timing is the following. First, the meetings happen. So with probability lambda, the inventor has a successful meeting. And then the network structure of psi describes the probability of meeting a particular type Km with a certain distribution over productivity capital F Km. After this meeting, the inventor has a new level of talent. They also draw a new foreign productivity differential epsilon prime. And after observing all of these, they decide where they want to go. Finally, the last line says that even if there is no successful meeting so that the talent remains the same, the inventor has a new draw of epsilon prime. And again, they evaluate where they want to go. So overall, this value summarizes the 3 reasons why an inventor wants to move in this setup, that are either searching for higher returns or searching for different interaction networks and better learning opportunities. And third, finally, there are also idiosyncratic reasons to move. So that, as we discussed before, the model produces both gross and net migration flows in the 2 directions. The last step then is how migration and innovation map into the evolution of aggregate TFP in the economy. As we've seen at the beginning, each country C has a continuum of intermediates that have heterogeneous quality and that are sold to the final good aggregator. So the aggregate TFP in this economy is equal to the average quality of the intermediate goods. Intermediates, in turn, they can improve their quality in 2 ways. The first is to purchase an idea bundle from inventors. So if an intermediate purchases an idea bundle Q, TFP will grow, as you see in the equation, the quality will grow by step size given by the size proportional to the size of the idea Q times the aggregate TFP, A bar C. Second, there is also exogenous technology diffusion from the country with the highest TFP, which I call the frontier, to the country with the lowest TFP, which I call the laggard, at an exogenous rate sigma. What this means is that the intermediate firms in the laggard economy receive this exogenous technology diffusion. And as we discussed before, sigma is going to map into the rate of relative TFP in equilibrium. As you can see from here, the important feature is that technology diffusion is proportional to the TFP gap between the 2 economies. And this is what guarantees the existence of a balanced growth path where the 2 economies grow at the same constant rate. Because whenever the laggard were to fall behind, the exogenous technology diffusion would get larger so that eventually they're always on the same path with the same growth rate. And then in practice, the growth rate in this economy summarizes the new elements of this model. That is, typically in the standard growth models, we can write the growth rate of the economy as the product of the number of ideas or innovation rate of the economy times the average size or step size of these ideas. In my setup, the growth rate has some new elements. That is, The number of ideas contains both the number of ideas produced by locals and by immigrants that are both endogenous in equilibrium. And the average size of ideas is also endogenous because it depends on the learning process, the network structure, and the knowledge spillovers across countries. So overall, a balanced growth path equilibrium in this economy is an equilibrium where, as I mentioned, the two countries grow at the same rate. This growth rate is determined by the innovation effort of the frontier economy, and the TFP gap between the frontier and the laggard is constant. So let me summarize here.
Marta, can I ask you a very quick question on this choice? Why is this the difference? Why is this constant? This this difference in TFP between frontier and
the difference is.
Yeah, the reason I'm asking a little bit, so just to, in a sense, if you, because we're looking at this from whatever 60s, 70s onwards, where the migration is primarily from Europe to the US. But if we were to look a little bit before, this wouldn't be the case. So there's something in there that somehow pushed the frontier way above the European frontier in the US. And it's probably not only migrants or universities, but it's probably related also to R&D, maybe more permissive, legal environment. I don't know. There could be all these elements. So, and generally these frontiers tend to co-evolve together somehow. Sometimes one is above the other. Sometimes the order is reversed. So I'm just wondering a little bit about this.
Yeah. That's a great question. So actually, for now, this is just the definition of what a balanced growth path equilibrium is. So when the two countries grow at the same rate, then by definition, that means that the TFP gap in this path is constant. But later on, I will show you a quantitative exercise where I solve the transitional dynamics after a policy change. And there, when solving the transitional dynamics, the TFP gap does not need to remain constant. In fact, I will show you that that changes.
Okay, perfect. And then, because there's many layers that you're introducing that makes the problem very interesting. The epsilon that you discussed in the beginning, isn't this somewhere in the aggregate linked to the TFP?
Yes, it's inside the Q.
Okay. Because if the epsilon evolves in a mean reverting fashion or some way, something has to go in opposite way to keep the TFP gap constant, at least for the balanced growth path.
Yes. So in this economy, individuals, they are born and die continuously. So it's a perpetual youth model, essentially. And what happens is that the epsilon are drawn from the stationary distribution of the mean reverting process. So whenever individuals go around this process of the epsilon, when they die, they are replaced with a new individual that is drawn from the same stationary distribution. So in the balanced growth path, the distribution of epsilon is also stationary.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. Yeah.
Okay. So let me summarize here the effects of migration on the equilibrium of this economy. Thinking about, suppose that location B is the frontier and there is net migration from A to B. Now, why would there be net migration? I haven't told you yet. In my application, this will come from heterogeneous policy across countries that I will show you in a few slides. But for now, think about the migration flow from A to B. This means that there are more inventors in location B that are also more productive when they move because they are selected. So overall, this increases innovation in B, which is the frontier. However, in a full version of this model that I will not show today, I allow for migrants to potentially crowd out locals. So this could have a negative effect on innovation in B. On the other hand, in country A, this migration means there are fewer inventors in A. This is the typical brain drain channel. But migrants transfer knowledge to locals in A that become more productive. So this increases innovation in A. And finally, country A also benefits from higher innovation at the frontier, thanks to the technology diffusion with a certain lag determined by sigma. So that overall, the effect on country A is ambiguous. And in fact, the goal in the next part of the paper is to use the data to discipline the parameters of these new forces and try to quantify the size of the different forces and the effect of migration. So this brings me to the empirical analysis and calibration. And from now on, I will focus on one particular application of this setup, where location A is the European Union and location B is the US. And since these are both developed economies, I will think of them as having the same exogenous parameters for the production side and for their initial talent distribution. And the only difference between the two economies that I will show you in a few slides is that they have different policies. The calibration then proceeds in several steps. First, the production side of the economy is common to the existing growth models in the literature. So I calibrate these parameters externally to match the literature. And then I bring in new data to calibrate the new parameters of this model that regard the learning process, the network structure, and the productivity evolution of migrants. To calibrate these parameters, I bring together multiple sources of data. But here, my main data source is a panel of inventors coming from the European Patent Office that runs from 1978 to 2016. This data allows me to observe the three important dimensions that I previewed before. That is, patents, as we have seen in the initial example, are similar to academic papers in the sense that they list all inventors that produce a certain technology, including their residential address. So this allows me to produce a measure of international mobility by observing changes in the residential address of inventors over time. So I call somebody an international migrant whenever I see that they move country, for example, from France to the US, as in my initial example. Second, in this data, I observe patent applications for each inventor in every year that I use as a proxy for the innovative output of inventors. And third, as again, this example showed, patents similar to papers list all of the co-inventors that contribute to a certain technology. And this is my measure of interaction networks. Next, I complement this data with information on aggregate flows of inventors that comes from the Patent Cooperation Treaty data. And third, finally, I use a commercial software for name ethnicity recognition to validate my measure of individual level migration. With this data, then, this is the first result that I document that describes the interaction network of different types of inventors. So what I'm doing in this picture is the following. I take all inventors in my data and I categorize them into 4 groups that are locals and migrants of European and American origin. I then collect the list of their collaborators from the patents and group the collaborators in the same 4 categories. The results here in this figure show the share of collaborators of each type for each category. So starting from the left, these are European local inventors. And what we see on the y-axis is that the largest share of their collaborators is also given by other local European inventors. The second bar, however, shows that for European migrants in the US, this is quite different. That is, they are much more likely to collaborate with local American inventors, as well as with other migrants. And the similar pattern is true for American inventors, that is, local Americans mostly work with local Americans, but American migrants in Europe are much more likely to collaborate with Europeans. This is what allows me to calibrate the network friction parameters in my model. That is, if you remember from before, psi was the probability for type CD to meet type KM. This comes from the data and is given by each of the segments in this figure. In my model, then, this was a product of the frequency of type KM in the economy that also comes from the data. This is the fraction of inventors of each type. So together, these 2 pieces of information allow me to calibrate the network friction parameters. The next step, then, is to document the evolution of patenting activity for migrants and their local collaborators. Now, importantly, this exercise is not meant to capture the causal effect of migration on productivity, because I do believe that migrants, or forced migration is endogenous, so migrants move precisely when they have a good opportunity. But the goal of this exercise is to produce results that map into the structure of my model. So just in the model 2, inventors move precisely when they have a high draw of their epsilon. Nevertheless, here I want to compare migrants with an appropriate control group, given that migrants are not similar to the average inventor in the economy. So what I do here is to use a one-to-one exact matching procedure, where I match every migrant with one control or placebo inventor in the country of origin. Now, this placebo inventor is not a migrant and not a co-inventor of the migrant, but is matched on the following characteristic. The control has the same country of origin of the migrant, the same first year in the sample, and the same cumulative patent stock by the time of migration. The next step is that I then build the network of collaborators in the country of origin, both for the real migrants, and I also collect the network of collaborators for the placebo group. And my goal is to compare the evolution of patenting activity for these different groups. That's what I show here in this figure. So first here, I'm comparing the migrants and the control group. So on the y-axis here, time 0 is the time when the real migrant moves away. To the left are the years before migration, and to the right, the years after. And the y-axis is the number of patent applications per year. The blue line here is the raw mean of patenting for the real migrants, and the dashed red line is the raw mean for the control group. So the takeaway from this picture is that after migration, migrants increase patent applications relative to the control group. And now here I'm just plotting the raw data to give a transparent depiction of this data. But then I also run a formal event study regression with additional controls to estimate the difference between these two lines. Yes, Colin?
There's no way that that permission to migrate is conditional on patents pending, is there in either case? So if I'm a European, and I want to demonstrate that I'm going to be a good, productive person to let into the United States, I don't show that I have patents pending. Does that?
So that's a very good point. So this is one of the concerns that I had when running this exercise, that is maybe individuals are just moving when they are on an upward trajectory.
Yes.
The important thing here is that what I'm plotting is exactly the patent applications. So these are pending patents that may have not received approval yet.
Oh, I see. So these are applications rather than granted. Okay.
These are applications. Okay, and so the important point here is that the migrant and the control group are on similar trends before migration. And notice here that what I've matched on is the cumulative patent stock before migration. So I don't require point by point the migrants and the control to have the same number of patents, precisely to use that instead of an ex post check to confirm that these two groups are on the same trajectory.
Can I try another thought experiment then? So what if so I've got this great idea, but I want to patent it in the US because I'm going to earn more by patenting. There are going to be less taxes. Does that make any sense as a reason? So I move to the US and then I apply for the patent. Does that make any sense?
Yeah. So this is a possibility, and in fact, as long as you want to move to the US after you patent your idea, this is going to be captured by a change in this change in patenting. This is why this is not the causal effect of migration, but is instead the goal here is to describe these dynamic patterns. And my model 2 has this idea that whenever you have a good idea or a high draw, you will move. And the more talented individuals have higher incentives to move because they earn higher returns to go to the best location when they have the good ideas.
But then the idea was already in their home country. So
essentially what this model says is that you are on a certain pattern of productivity, and the selection implies that you will choose to move whenever you have a high enough both epsilon and z, a combination of z and epsilon.
Okay.
That is.
So this eventually then boils down to just having more commercial opportunity then.
Yes. I will show you how this figure maps exactly into the model, and I think this will be clear in a couple of slides, and we can return to this.
Thanks.
So now, still going back to the data for 1 second, this is the figure for the collaborators of migrants and the control group. So time 0 here again is the time when the real migrant moves away. But the blue line now is the patenting of the collaborators of the real migrants in the country of origin. And the red line is for the collaborators of the control group. And the takeaway here is that after migration, the collaborators of the real migrants increase patenting relative to the collaborators of the control group. And the size of these changes is an increase in patenting of 42% per year on average for the real migrants, whereas the increase is of about 15% for the collaborators. So now, going back to our discussion, how is this useful to calibrate the model? The full model has 26 parameters, but here I'm highlighting the ones for the new channels of my setup. And these are the meeting frictions that I showed you before, come directly from the picture on collaboration networks. And then the rest of the parameters are jointly calibrating using a simulated method of moments. And these in particular are the parameters of the productivity process of the migrants, the learning technology, and the cost of migration. So let me show you with 2 figures an intuition of this calibration strategy. These are DSM event studies that we have just seen, but in the data and in the model. So the figure on the left is again the one that compares the real migrants to the control group. The crosses come from the data and are the estimated difference between the 2 lines we have just seen. I then produce a sample of simulated inventors from my model and do the same matching procedure and event study regression. And the result of that is given by the red circles. So what's happening in the model is that when inventors move, they change their interaction network and they have the epsilon form productivity differential. In particular, the jump after migration is because the epsilon kicks in the production function for innovation. But over time, the epsilon on average reverts to the mean, which is why the productivity of migrants tends to decline after the initial jump. So this figure on the left is particularly useful to calibrate the parameter of the productivity process for the migrants. The one
you
on the right,
that non-monotonicity there, is it 4 years? That dip and then it jumps back up. And you seem to see that on the right-hand side as well, yes.
So you're asking why this point is particularly down in the data?
Yeah, is that just a small data set problem or?
I've been looking into this. The answer is, I don't know for sure, but my conjecture is that this is the typical expiration date for H-1B visas. Typically, they last for 3 years. So this may be a point where many of these people are going back.
Okay, I see. Okay, so that only captures one transition.
Right. This is, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and then the figure on the right is the one for the local collaborators. So in the model, what this means is the time 0 is the time when a local inventor meets a migrant for the first time. So these local inventors, they don't have an epsilon because they are locals. The only reason why their productivity changes in the model is because of learning from the migrants, which is why this figure on the right is particularly useful to calibrate the parameters of the learning process. And that's why together these 2 figures go into the simulated method of moments to inform both the learning process and the epsilon process of the migrants. Now, in the last few minutes, I want to discuss the equilibrium and one of the quantitative exercises. So as I mentioned before in my application, the 2 countries are identical, but they have different policies. One is a tax on the returns to innovation that I calibrate to be higher in Europe and lower in the US. So this is going back to our discussion. What happens in equilibrium is that European inventors are incentivized to move to the US because of this lower tax rate. these inventors are also selected when they move, so that what this means is that in equilibrium, the US have more inventors, have higher average human capital, higher TFP, higher innovation, even if they have the same exogenous parameter as the European Union. So this is also going back to Mina's question from before, that is, the model has this idea that if you are on a productive trajectory, if you move to the US to produce your idea, you will have higher returns in my application because of this tax wedge. But you can think of other applications where wedges to returns come from other things, such as better government support for R&D or better financial system, anything that changes the return to innovation. So the other policy is the immigration cap that I discussed in the paper, and then I will leave aside for today. So what I want to show you now is the policies exercise that is a tax cut for return migrants and US immigrants in the EU. And the reason for this particular exercise is that it has the flavor of real world policies that several European countries have implemented at different points in time with the goal of reverting the brain drain. So in practice, what this means in my model is to solve the transitional dynamics from the initial BGP, where the EU has the higher tax rate, to a new BGP where the EU has lower tax rate for foreigners and return migrants. And here are the results first on the migration side. That is, in this picture, the x-axis is the number of years since the policy implementation. The y-axis describes the fraction of migrants, the migrants as a fraction of domestic inventors. This green line is the stock of American inventors in Europe. After this policy, American migrants in Europe increase because they are now attracted by the lower tax rate. At the same time, the other line, the red line, is the stock of European migrants in the US. And this decreases because these migrants are now incentivized to return to Europe, because if they return, they will have a lower tax rate. On the other side, we see the effect on innovation. So the x-axis here is the same, but the y-axis is innovation as a percentage of GDP. And what this figure shows in red is that innovation increases in Europe, and in green, innovation declines in the US as a result of this talent reallocation across the two countries. And also going back to Minia's question from the beginning, here I'm also plotting the TFP gap. So as you see along these transitional dynamics, the TFP gap changes. And in particular, in these first 25 years, Europe is increasing the relative TFP relative to the US. Now, one thing that I want to mention here is that when I simulate this model, the elasticity of mobility that the model produces is in line with the empirical studies of this type of policy. For example, when it's been introduced in Denmark, so that the mobility that is produced by the model is in line with the mobility that is empirically estimated. However, the last thing that I can do with this model is to also trace the impact on output. That's what I'm showing in this figure, where the x-axis is still the same, but the y-axis is describing output relative to the initial balanced growth path. So just to be sure, this is a growing economy, so output is always going up, but this is a plot of output after the policy is introduced relative to output in the counterfactual initial balanced growth path. So what we see here in the green line is that relative output in the US is declining because of lower innovation in the US. But I'm more interested in here, output in Europe increases for a few decades, but eventually then it starts to decline again. And the reason for this change in pattern is described by the table on the right. So what this table shows is the decomposition of the different forces that I described at the end of the theoretical section at two different time horizons. Now here, there are several forces that have different signs. And the one that I want to highlight that's at the core of the new setup of my model is given by knowledge spillovers. That is, what I want to show here is that this policy, by reducing migration flows across countries, it also reduces knowledge spillovers. And eventually, over time, these knowledge spillovers have a sizable effect on output, but they take a long time to become effective because what they do is to change the distribution of human capital productivity across the two countries. And this takes a very long time to converge to the new path. And finally, the last thing that I want to mention here is that the fact that output declines in Europe in this setup is a function of this particular exercise and initial conditions. That is, in this model, the two countries are perfectly symmetric. So if Europe introduced a different type of policy or a larger tax cut or an incentive for Americans so that it could actually attract Americans and revert the initial equilibrium, this model allows for the possibility for Europe to actually increase output in the long run by attracting talent and sort of revert the initial equilibrium. And in addition to that, even if in this particular exercise, output decreases in Europe in the long run, when I do a simple welfare calculation, it actually turns out that the policy is welfare increasing for Europe. That is, what I'm doing is to simply compute the discounted consumption streams at time 0. And because the decline in output is so far into the future, the welfare measure at time 0 that includes a discount rate and the death rate is such that at time 0, Europeans would still gain in welfare on average from introducing the policy.
So, Marta, I have a very quick question maybe before the conclusion chart. The number, this minus 9.7 for the 200 years out knowledge spillover loss, the way to interpret this, and tell me if this is incorrect, is that we do not allow these inventors to go abroad by giving them the tax incentive. We keep them, but had they gone to the US, the knowledge that they would have produced would have given us more by spillover effects rather than having them on site?
Okay, so that's a good question. So let me describe here what I'm doing here. Actually, with this policy, because this policy targets return inventors, these individuals are still going abroad and returning to Europe in this equilibrium, but they return more. And what I'm doing here in this table is to shut down several effects one at a time. That is, there are several things that are changing. That is the total mass of inventors of different types, the average productivity, and also the technology diffusion. So what I'm doing in this knowledge spillover, what I'm doing with the knowledge spillover channel is, what is the change that comes from the fact that the network structure has changed because now there are fewer migrants in the economy. So this orange line is trying to separate the effect that comes only from a change in the network structure if I kept everything else the same.
Okay. So this is basic, but so the tax incentive keeps people in Europe or brings them back, correct?
Brings them back, yes.
So this would mean more links, more you know, random encounters, more chance meetings that allow for exchange of information for Europe, right?
That's a good point. So let me show this with this figure. Essentially, what's happening, what you see here, the red line is the stock of European migrants. That's declining. That is, in the new equilibrium, a local in Europe has a lower chance to meet a migrant because there are fewer European migrants. And this reduction in meetings in migrants is what I call the knowledge spillover channel.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, and in the appendix of the paper, I have a figure that shows how this network structure is changing. I don't have it here. Yeah. But that's the intuition essentially. Okay, great. And so let me wrap up by describing what I've done today is to first describe a framework to study migration decision, knowledge networks, and innovation, and also provided some new data to calibrate the new elements of this setup. The key takeaway for me from this paper is to point out that migration and then policies that change migration produce several effects on the economy that have opposite signs. And I also want to point out that one particular force that I can quantify well with my data is the one given by knowledge spillovers that eventually have a sizable effect on output, even if they have a long time horizons. And finally, to me, this project also opens some interesting questions for future research. That is, today I've studied two developed economies, but one question is how important are knowledge spillovers in other contexts, such as developing countries? And on the other hand, going back to the more general framework, I think it would be also interesting to study into more detail what's the relationship between migration, occupational sorting, that is something I have not discussed today, and the effect on inequality, both within and across countries. Thank you very much for your questions and the discussion.
Many thanks, Marta. This was, so just so we let those know who are still around, this is a 90-page, almost 90-page paper that I think Marta did a wonderful job to summarize. And there's many things that were very interesting, but we had perhaps little time to cover. I just have a general comment and perhaps something that's worth investigating in the data. The thickness of these networks and the structure of these networks, I remember there were very similar studies in the US, maybe in the 80s, that were linking though the location in a city of a particular inventor and the size of the city, transportation, and so on and so forth. So urban structure was shown to help or hinder. And then people thought, how do we design cities to help innovation? But that sort of died out at some point. There are some very interesting technical papers that were sort of doing this thing where you link and track over time patterns. So what I'm thinking, this network effects could have something to do with a degree of urbanization between the two, let's call them federations, if you wish. It's perhaps easier to meet an interesting inventor in the US because everybody flocks to a big city. But in Europe, you have like these mega cities, but then it's countryside or smaller cities with no big universities and so on and so on. So I was wondering maybe this could help further, bring some insights into this.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And in fact, that's a margin that I haven't explored much yet. That is in my setup. The number of meetings that you have in what I'm shown today is the same, regardless of where you are. What changes is just the composition of your meetings. But I think what you were getting at is that even how many people you can meet in itself can be different in the
Yes.
two locations.
Yeah.
So
I'm thinking one very simple way to check if this idea has any value is to check the number of patents as a function of city size or number of students per whatever 100,000 residents in a particular city, or particular urban dimensions that could help this.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I haven't tried that, but it's feasible with this data.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I've just stopped the recording, but if you've got time, Marta, if other people have questions, Joanne, you've been very patiently just sitting here as an attendee. Do you have any questions? I think you can unmute yourself. Okay. I'll take that as more questions. Marta, can I ask, so the network friction parameter that you're fitting, what if that is incentivized in some way? What if there's a higher probability of meeting someone with whom I'm a good match? So yeah. That would be a reduced form way of taking into account search in some ways.
Yeah, I think
a Tinder for inventors.
I think that's a great point. That is, this model has taken a shortcut in the sense that you don't choose who you're meeting with, and at the end of the day, I think the main constraint to me was like in how to keep this structure solvable in a growing economy.
Yeah.
One thing
Yeah,
that
no,
I have tried to do that I think is in the appendix of the paper is to think about how productive your meetings are relative to who you meet. So essentially what's happening right now, you can think about the whole population in a certain group as an integral. And what I've showed today is that you can learn from anyone along this integral and you don't direct your search. But my appendix shows essentially that a way to capture a flavor of what you mentioned is to change the bounds of this integral. That is, for example, you could only learn from people that are better than you, is one example.
Okay.
Or you could only learn from people that are essentially in an interval around you. That is, if somebody is too much better than you, you cannot learn from them.
Sure.
And when I do that, I show that you can also change the meeting probabilities in such a way that you sort of direct your search only to the interval where you know you will